I want to talk about two things in principle. First of all, thinking about the notion of the seed, both as a witness, but also as what I call, and various other people call, a biosocial archive. And I want to think about not only this, but think about the way in which artistic works allow us to think these issues through, and the propositions that are made by certain sort of art/research practices. And also thinking about this notion of sort of investigative memorialization, which has already been discussed, this incredibly rich kind of concept that's proposed by Milica, by the Monument Group as well, whose work I had the pleasure of engaging with a few years ago. And thinking about, this is something that I've been thinking about in my own research around a sort of expanded concept of witnessing, thinking about the heritage of sort of decades of testimony theory that's kind of been structured around these divergences between testimony as a sort of search for the empirical, the evidentiary, sort of facts, let's say, on the ground, the production of truth, and testimony as the idea of the kind of unsayable, that which is at the limits of representation. So you have on the one hand, and this is a very straightforward way of thinking about this, and the way that Milica presented it was far more complex and I think more generative, but thinking about the investigative as the evidentiary, and then the memorial or memorialization as practices that are more poetic, that sort of lend themselves to the sort of evasion of capture, let's say. And we see that very much in the way that the work of Grupa Spomenik was presented yesterday. So I wanted to sort of translate those thoughts into the idea of nature and the seed. So in my abstract, I said I'd talk about 3 artist practices. There's only going to be time to talk about 2, so I'll just jump straight in. The first one is a body of work that some of you may be familiar with by the artist Maria Teresa Alves. It's a project entitled Seeds of Change. And it's an ongoing investigation that began in 1999 based on original research of ballast flora in various port cities of Europe, and more recently in New York City. So I'll just flick through a few slides. This is actually in Bristol. And this, as in many other installations, she's actually created a ballast garden. And I'll explain the ballast. So basically materials such as stones, earth, sand, wood, and bricks was used as ballast to stabilize merchant sailing ships according to the weight of the cargo. So upon arrival in port, the ballast was unloaded, carrying with it seeds that were native to the area where it had been collected. So the source of these seeds can be any of the ports or regions and their regional trading partners involved in trade with Europe. So ballast is this material that's used to weigh the ship down, basically, and sort of inadvertently, seeds get caught up in this. So to give an example, in the 2017 iteration in New York, which was entitled A Botany of Colonization, we learned that hundreds of thousands of tons of ballast arrived in New York City each month. So on 30th of June 1990, for instance, 7,584,000 tons of ballast, I think that's correct, reached the city's ports from a range of destinations. So for instance, Colombia, various Caribbean islands, Venezuela, British Guyana, the Chinese Empire, the Dutch East Indies, Japan, and the British Cape Colony in today's South Africa. This is in Bristol. This is just an example of some of the kind of archival work that goes into the project and its display. So this was in Marseille. This was the exhibition in New York that I mentioned, where seeds are collected, a kind of archaeology is carried out, and then seeds are regrown in the exhibition space. And this quote, so as Alves writes in relation to the example from One Day in New York City that I just mentioned, quote, and it's here, "Accumulations and processes between different beings, including the land, make a specific place, or make a place specific. Earth itself becomes a witness and provides testimony of the multi-species relationships of placemaking. Or, in the words of the late critic Jean Fisher, seeds here can be understood to function as migration's silent witnesses." So staying with this notion, and this is just a few of the sort of maps and drawings that accompany the project. I'll go back. So staying with this notion of silent witnesses, I'm sort of struck by this and trying to unearth or sort of figure out what exactly is meant by this. We might understand this to mean that seeds here stand in, i.e. as proxies, for the witnesses who did not survive to tell their tale. So those who are deceased of natural causes, or more poignantly in the case of global trade, history's missing or silenced, those whose testimony was never valid. So those human witnesses who were deemed lesser than human. And of course, I'm referring here to the transatlantic slave trade, as well as those whose life worlds were destroyed in the creation of a global extractivist plantation economy. So in other words, that these silent witnesses, these seeds, these living beings that witness and bear witness, are witnesses in two senses. So witnesses in the sense of the testis, the third party, who observes and subsequently tells the tale. So in this case, not through language, but simply by the very fact of germinating or growing in a new environment. So they bear witness simply by the fact of existing and in a certain place. Or in the second sense, witness in the sense of the superstes, the survivor of the longue durée event, quote unquote, of migration, racial capitalism, and so on. And all of this in the absence of suitable state-endorsed, or at least structures and practices of memorialization. So employed as such, the language of testimony produces what we might think of as a kind of poetic generativity. But the term silent witness has another sense, one that is more investigative, and that also gestures towards questions of accountability and an intersectional conception of environmental justice that questions the rendering profitable and the rendering disposable of all forms of life, human and vegetal. So here we can recall the basic principle of forensic science formulated by Edmond Locard, that every contact leaves a trace. So in other words, every contact leaves trace evidence, a silent witness that speaks, quote unquote, alongside or in the absence of human testimony. So in the context of the seeds that were germinated in the floating garden at Bristol, for instance, I do not know to what degree or whether at all one might forensically link a particular plant to a particular crime that took place decades ago across or in or on the Atlantic. Even if these particulars are part of a broader conversation precisely around the obfuscation or the denial of particularities and singularities that is taking place with a fervor in parts of both the US and Europe around reparations, be they colonial or with regards to the lasting legacies of slavery. So i.e., all of this is to be understood as part of a broader discussion around inheritance and the responsibility of those who live on. But what is certainly at stake here is the manner in which certain contexts, as the architect Adrian Lahoud writes, precipitate a drifting apart of the Locardian contact and trace. And with this, the challenge of producing evidence of direct accountability. So for instance, on the part of nation states, or of course today we could think about corporations. So Lahoud's objective analysis in saying that his objective analysis in this case is human-induced climate change and the movement of bodies, of human bodies of climate refugees, as well as, for instance, bodies of aerosol particles. And I mention this because one of the issues that forms a backdrop against which I'm speaking is that of migration and a broader movement of drift. So drift both of bodies, but also a temporal and spatial drift in conceiving of the notion of event. And here I want to pick up on what Milica was talking about yesterday. So rethinking the notion of event and its kind of temporal and spatial boundaries. So here to quote, and I'm quoting from Lahoud, in the elongated space-time between the crime and its consequence, myriad forces intervene. Clarifying them becomes not only a scientific priority, but also a political and ethical one. And it's here that Seeds of Change takes its force. So in Alves's words, in her work of unearthing, it's not forensic evidence to a particular crime that is sought, but a broader picture of migration and displacement. Through its mapping of generations and geographies of subsumed histories, Seeds of Change produces an archaeology that functions both at on an empirical plane, so what seeds grew where, when, what trajectories they took, and whose life worlds they passed through, and also at the level of cultural imaginaries and the narratives used to produce and uphold these. And I'm showing these images because on the one hand, I'm thinking about this in terms of kind of a search for the evidentiary, and yet these drawings are really quite far from that. So in Alves's words, the seeds contained in ballast soil, quote, potentially bear witness to a far more complex narrative of world history than is usually presented by orthodox accounts. So to quote at length, it's here. Although they have the potential to alter our notions of the identity of place as belonging to a defined bioregion, the historical importance of these seeds is rarely acknowledged. The Seeds of Change project is, therefore, designed to question those discourses that define the geographical and quote-unquote natural history of place. At what moment do seeds become native, quote-unquote? What are the socio-political histories of place that determine the framework of belonging? And it's with this notion of the kind of native, non-native, and issues of belonging and movement that I move over into the next example, or next artwork, which is a film by Jumana Mana entitled Wild Relatives, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. I'll get to the issue of migration. It's kind of implicit in everything I'll be saying, but I will come back to that. So this is a film from 2018, feature-length film, which moves between two landscapes. So first of all, Svalbard, a remote Norwegian archipelago in the Arctic Ocean. And you see a few images here. And secondly, the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. So the catalyst for the film was the 2015 request by the International Center for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas, ICADA, for the return of part of its genetic materials that had been duplicated and stored at the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. I mean, the vault itself is quite iconic. Usually you have images of it set against this kind of icy icescape, let's say. This is a more mundane image. It's kind of useful insofar as it shows that the entrance to the vault is actually quite small. Normally the photography is very sort of bombastic in a sense. So this Noah's Ark, as it's been called repeatedly, which opened in 2008 and which literally freezes seeds, is the world's largest collection of crop diversity, safeguarding duplicates of seed samples from collections around the world. So it's been described as the ultimate insurance policy for the world's food supply, or the final backup. So due to the ongoing Syrian civil war that began in 2011, the Aleppo branch of ICADA came under threat, with equipment looted and staff forced into exile. It was decided that the reconstruction of the original collection from Syria was best carried out across various locations in the similar climatic conditions of Morocco and Lebanon, where existing ICADA premises were expanded. I've written about the film in a longer article. It's in a special issue of Third Text that I co-edited with Ros Gray, as was already mentioned. So I just want to point to a few of the issues, just also picking up on what Milica was saying yesterday about the sort of notion of the event. So there I was talking about this, the kind of the figure ground analogy, let's say, and the way in which we can read this sort of big media event of the withdrawal of the seeds in light of the Syrian civil war, but also read that in the longer context of the Green Revolution. So thinking about the revolutions that were taking place across the Arab world in terms of the ground of the Green Revolution, the US-led Green Revolution. And sort of thinking about notions of eventfulness and conflict and violence through those. So what the film quietly suggests is that the political stakes in the conservation of biodiversity and heritage are in fact often as high as in the world of international diplomacy and peacemaking, involving policies that contribute to the slower erosion of the ground, i.e. the ground upon which the spectacular events of conflicts take place. And this is something I look at in terms of the history of the Green Revolution and the way in which this was carried out supposedly in the notion of improvement. This is something we've heard a lot about, but which in hindsight we've seen it has quite sort of disastrous consequences. But this, the global media event, is just one part of the story. So Wild Relatives, which follows the annual life cycle of the seed and gives an account of 12 months in the lives of people from Lebanon, Syria, and Norway who engage with the land in various ways, provides just some of the many other narratives and perspectives that need to be told. So Mana's camera takes us from the global seed vault, from where the duplicates are dispatched, to the fields, laboratory, and gene bank in the Bekaa Valley, where the seeds are reawakened from their frozen lapses, cultivated and duplicated, and then sent back into exile in Svalbard. So the aim of this is to ensure that more than one copy of each variety is accessible, so frozen seeds stored in ex situ vaults such as Svalbard serve as proxies for actual crops. And here we sort of recall what I was saying about Alves's work and the notion of seeds as proxies, or proxy witnesses. So Wild Relatives presents a chorus of stakeholders, including agroecologists, lab technicians, receptionists, and field laborers, and their daily interactions with the land and the seeds, as well as with the policies, often hierarchical and exclusionary, which determine the plight of human and human life. So amongst the protagonists, this is in the Bekaa Valley, what's so interesting is the perspective of many of the shots. You actually see things from the position of the seed. So you have Yusuf, the son of a Lebanese farmer no longer able to make a living from farming, who taxes school children and goods, including the crates of the vacuum-packed seeds that arrive from Svalbard, from the airport to the Akada Bank and back again, as well as smuggling Syrians and Syrian refugees and renting his land to refugees. And there's a really poignant scene in the film where he's discussing the way in which it's actually more profitable to rent one's land to the UNHCR for refugee camps than it is to farm the land. And then there's also Walid, a Syrian refugee who's living in the Bekaa Valley, who tends to a plot of land using organic traditional methods and preserves local seed varieties in glass jars and paper bags in a makeshift seed library. So rather than being premised upon ownership and profit, Walid's domestic seed collection, which is more akin to a kind of unofficial open access library than a bank, is a site of improvised grassroots custodianship that's practiced in spite of the policies of the nation state. So furthermore, he dreams of sending seeds and instructions for organic farming back to rebel-held Syria. So in this regard, the scenes with Walid, together with those of the refugee field laborers, which I'll come to, are vital for bearing witness to practice of cultivation and political imaginaries that transcend the false exclusions of nationalism and the limitations of the nation state. So to cut a long story short, what the film also gestures towards is the manner in which, paradoxically, global seed banking and the dissemination of supposedly improved crop varieties has the effect of eliminating the land races, so the local varieties, that derive from wild relatives, the wild species that are untended by humans and continue to evolve in the wild, developing traits such as drought tolerance and pest resistance that can in turn be used to strengthen cultivars. So in other words, these are the species, the relatives are actually more resilient insofar as they're adaptable to their local conditions. And furthermore, by referring back to the refusal of a return to normativity that was mentioned yesterday, the film questions the techno-scientific dream of preservation and a return to some arbitrary level of prior level of biodiversity, this idea of plenitude. So a form of undoing and rewinding that anthropologist Renato Rosaldo names imperialist nostalgia. So coming back to the seed as a locus of investigative memorialization, Wild Relatives proposes that we consider the body of the seed itself as an archive. So whilst much of Manas's work is concerned with an interrogation of the archive in general, Wild Relatives at least tangentially prompt us to consider the body of the seed as a site of entanglement that bears witness to reciprocal relationships between humans and non-humans of co-evolution. In other words, seeds here can be considered as biosocial archives, an archive of the evolutionary histories of crop varieties, of intergenerational, interspecies human-plant kinship relations. In other words, of co-cultivation, or if we can think of what Donna Haraway names nature's cultures, to which, of course, we're including techne. So as the archaeobotanist Marika van der Dien writes, the seed itself can be understood as a site of culture, one that is never quite fully translatable or objectifiable through language. So here materiality becomes a useful prism through which to view the seed, designating less what the seed as object means and more what it does and is, above all as part of a meshwork of relationships. So the seed in this reading is a site of an animated liveliness, a site of a kind of sense of biological matter through which varying layers of power, knowledge, and desire coalesce. So in this sense, the agribusiness archive, such as the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, might be seen as disavowing the lively and never quite fully masterable wonder of the seed as it interacts with its environment and local traditions of cultivation and custodianship. And here you can just get a sense of the sort of divergence in terms of the treatment of the seeds. You have these sort of preserved objects in the archive. This is actually now moving through the seed bank in Ikada in the Bekaa Valley. And this is the sort of investigation of the seeds. And then you have in the fields the sort of the cultivation of the crops and the gathering of different varieties. And then you have Walid, who's engaging his permaculture. So what I want to stress here is that you have this kind of sense of affect that's produced by the film. This notion of the kind of unmasterable or the untranslatable is really conveyed in the way in which the sort of the characters in the film are relating to and handling the materials. I realize I'm already over time, so I will just say, what did I want to say? Yeah, there's this notion of the affective, and there's also what I think is interesting in the film is there's a notion of ambivalence insofar as also sort of carrying on with what Erai was saying about thinking resistance beyond this dichotomy of the state, the expert, the institutional, and then the layman, sort of thinking about the traditional notion of cultivation and custodianship. The film really doesn't take sides. I mean, there's much to critique about global seed-saving practices, but what's being shown is this kind of ambivalence in terms of all the individuals who are actually engaging with the seed. So it's not this dichotomy between technoscience and tradition, let's say. There's much more to say about migration, also thinking about the seed bank or these practices, thinking about the fields as sites of memorialization, really picking up on this notion of kind of heritage, cultural heritage, also including agriculture, but as this kind of open-ended processual engagement. So in the article, I talk about a kind of critique of the way in which seed-saving practices or archival practices can often be thought about in terms of sort of freezing things, placing them in a kind of, let's say, a lapsus. And this is something that people talk about in terms of cryopolitics, for instance. But there's also a very strong Orientalist gesture in here. So we had a mention yesterday of environmental Orientalism, but also the way in which sort of a memorialization heritage needs to be thought of as a sort of processual notion of becoming. I'll leave it there. Sorry, thank you for your patience over time.